I'm not going to try to waste any of your time. This is, well, my old Sony FX6, and don't freak out, I still sold it, but I did borrow it for this video. And in today's video, we're actually going to compare it to the red Komodo X. Now, I have been using this for the last 2 years, and I have been using this for a couple of months now. And after a couple months of using the red Komodo X, I kind of want to answer the question of what the Sony FX6 could change to make me go back. We'll talk about it. Now, this video isn't going to be sponsored by Sony, and it's definitely not sponsored by Red, but it is sponsored by Storyblocks. More on that a little bit later. Now, these two cameras are pretty small, but they are drastically different from each other in terms of how its body and its design works. Now, the red Komodo X is a small cube-like function that everybody loves because it makes it easy to rig out, it makes it compact, and you could dress it up and dress it down depending on your situation. It does have a locking RF mount, so it's great if you want to adapt it to EF, which you can do even with a speed booster, and you could do the same with a PL, or you could just use normal PL lenses with an adapter as well. I also like that the screen of this camera is actually on the body itself. It makes it a lot easier to address all of the functions that are on here, and if I'm using something like a top handle that might block it, I can always get monitors that have control of the camera itself, but I have a big enough screen that I can see everything, where on the Sony FX6, it's a kind of small screen, it's kind of crappy, it's not that bright, and overall I kind of don't like it. Now, another thing that's not necessarily going for the Sony FX6 is going to be that audio top handle. This guy, this audio top handle. Yes, this literally is my old audio top handle. I had this camera for a long time, and in fact, this is literally my camera that I borrowed, and that audio top handle was always annoying when I needed things for gimbal work, or I just didn't want to use that top handle, and I preferred something else instead. I kind of wish, and what would make me go back in terms of a body design feature, is the fact that if this guy did have like a 3.5mm jack or an external output that I could put on the top of this guy without having to worry too much about the audio, well, then this would make it a lot more easier and a lot more useful of a camera, especially in terms of versatility. Now, one thing that Sony FX6 does have going for it, and we'll talk about it a bit later, is going to be the built-in ND. The red Komodo X and a lot of red cameras just don't have built-in ND filters. You have to kind of go up to the red Raptor XL to get one that's built in, and that could cost a lot of money. Now, the Sony FX6 does not hold back, and it does have 7 stops of ND inside of the camera body, making it a lot more useful when you're in an uncontrollable environment, or you don't want to spend money on ND filters. Now, outside of its audio kind of quirks, one thing that would bring me back to the Sony FX6 is the fact that if it did use CF Express Type B cards. Now, for some people that doesn't mean a lot, because when you're switching camera systems, you could always just get the necessary memory for it. However, if you're coming from a different system, or you want to use faster cards that do cost a little bit less money, CF Express Type B is more than viable enough to have red footage on it, and the Sony Bravano actually has 2 CF Express Type B card slots, so if I was able to put that in the Sony FX6, I definitely would. Now, I'm used to using SDI in terms of the monitors that I have, but it is kind of nice that the Sony FX6 does have both. I can use HDMI up here if I want to connect to things like the Atomos Ninja 5, or if I have an SDI monitor, I can do that as well. Now, on the red Komodo X, you only have the option of SDI, and you have to follow a protocol in order to make sure that you don't burn out your port. Now, most people don't necessarily know this, but you actually have to do that on most ports with SDI input. It just so happens that a lot of cinema cameras have both HDMI and SDI, and I kind of wish the red Komodo X had it, but honestly, you get used to it after a while and it's not a big deal. Now, overall, I do think the red Komodo X is a lot more versatile in terms of its rigging, especially if I want to solve an audio issue. I could always get the XLR module, which I already have, and I could use that in order to get decent sound, and I don't have to deal with a giant top handle. Speaking of top handles, you do have to put a couple accessories to get this thing to work. You still have to get the side handle and the top handle that comes with it, and the LCD monitor in order to see anything that's on the camera itself. But on the flip side, the red Komodo X could pretty much get started with a lens, a battery, and you might want to get like a side handle that you can pick up a small rig RE rosette and a cheap handle, and you can start working this thing right away. Now, what the FX6 has going for it is that it actually has a lot of those things that come with it, and the red Komodo doesn't. However, a lot of people say you need a ton of accessories to get the red Komodo X to work properly. I don't actually agree with that, and I'll actually address that in another video. Now, the Sony FX6 does have a very limited pool in terms of the codecs that you can use. You could use the XAVC-I, which is great, but if you want to go to the lower XAVC-L, you're actually dropping down to 8-bit, which kind of defeats the purpose of getting the Sony FX6 in a lot of ways anyway. Now, the red Komodo X does have R3D RAW, and we'll compare that a little bit, but one other thing that actually goes for the FX6 in its favor is the fact that it does have built-in NDs. Now, you could have all your settings dialed in, and it might still be too bright, and the Sony FX6 does have built-in ND filters, but up to 7 stops that you could actually help control things. Where on the red Komodo X and other red cameras, it doesn't have it. So something that would make me go back to the FX6 is actually if it didn't change that feature. Sony, don't change how you guys do the built-in NDs. They're great, and I love the fact that you have an electronic VND, which actually adjusts your exposure automatically depending on your situation. Now, one thing that is cool about the Red Komodo X versus the Sony FX6 in terms of exposure is that the Red Komodo X actually doesn't have a native ISO. Now, I did talk about this in a different video in terms of how the Red Komodo X works in terms of exposure, but I do like the fact that as long as I pay attention to my traffic lights and I maintain my image in terms of protecting the highlights and my blacks from clipping, then what ends up happening is that I have a lot more to play with in terms of that R3D RAW. On top of that, this thing also shoots in ProRes, and the files are a little bit big and they're a little bit inflated. However, if I don't want to use RAW or I don't have the capacity for it, I could always use ProRes on this thing, where the Sony FX6 only has that internal XAVC-I if I want to use a 10-bit codec. Now, in terms of the Sony FX6 having RAW, it actually wouldn't be the end of the world if it didn't add that into there, but I kind of just wish that they added more higher quality codecs or just a different variety of different ways you could shoot your footage depending on your situation, because I feel like you're kind of cornered into using one very specific way of shooting footage on this camera. But if you added some variability, I wouldn't mind going back. Now, this video is sponsored by Storyblocks. Now, you might have heard about these guys before, but you have an unlimited royalty-free library of a bunch of different assets at one predictable price, so you don't have to pay per use for every single one. You can get anything from video clips in up to 4K, sound effects, or you could even get some After Effects templates to make your editing that much faster and that much easier. What's also super nice that you can get all of this with one predictable price point. You don't have to actually buy per clip, or you have to buy per project template. You can pay one price for unlimited access, and you don't have to worry about getting any scary emails anytime soon. And if you're somebody on Premiere Pro or on After Effects, you could access the entire library on Storyblocks within the program that you're editing in. That way you don't have to open up a separate browser and go fishing through all the footage. You can actually do that native into the program to make things that much faster. Now, some of you guys are watching this video talking about the Komodo X or the Sony FX6, and you might be thinking, I don't have those cameras and I don't have that high quality footage. You could use things like Storyblocks as a limited stock library in order to bridge the gap in some of your client projects in order to make your workflow easier. Now, if you guys do want to get started today, you can click the link on the screen or the one down below in order to get started with Storyblocks today. A special shout out to them for actually sponsoring this video, but let's actually talk about some of the footage between these two cameras, and for everybody else, you can just get some stock footage from Storyblocks. Now, if you're looking for a scientific comparison, you're not going to find it here. I'm not someone who's super technical and super nitty gritty, but I'm just going to take a look at these images and tell you what my thoughts are. Now, right out of the box, I will say something. The FX6 actually has really nice skin tones here. The color is actually really good. And the Red Komodo X, albeit is going to be more flexible at 16-bit RAW, so if I want to push a grade, I could probably make it look a little bit better. But right out of the box with the Rec. 709 LUT, it looks nice on the FX6. Now, this is where there's going to be a little bit of a difference, and this is also super surprising. When I zoom in quite a bit, the FX6 is actually going to be a bit sharper, even though the Red Komodo X is in 6K. And the reason for that might be is because I am shooting on the brand new 24-70 Mark II G Master lens on the Sony FX6, whereas the Red Komodo I'm shooting on the 15-35, which is a little bit older. So if you are someone that's into a super sharp image and you want to spend over $3,000 for it, you can go and pick up that 24-70, and you may have a sharper image than the Red Komodo X. That's just something to kind of keep into context. These lenses obviously can't be the same, they're different sensors, and because I want to test out things like autofocus, I have to shoot RF on one and I have to shoot E-mount on the other. Now, I'm going to keep on the theme of actually not being super technical. I'm also not a colorist as well, so if you're hoping for any one of those two things, you're coming to the wrong place. However, looking at the two of these guys, the Red Komodo X does have more dynamic range in the highlights. Now, this is generally my litmus test in terms of what's a good dynamic range. I usually set up an interview scenario. I have my key light on my subject. I make sure to try to expose for my windows as best as I can. I equate the exposures at the same ISO, aperture, and shutter angle, and then I try to bring the highlights down in DaVinci Resolve on either clip and see how much I get back. Now, as you can clearly see, the Red Komodo X does have a little bit more in terms of the highlights here, and that's something that's not necessarily surprising because it does have more dynamic range than the Sony FX6. However, if you want to bring things down a little bit more using an ND filter and then use a light to bring it up, you could also get some similar results. The only thing is that you're actually going to need a little bit more light in order to light up the background so the exposure and the look you're going for looks the same in either image. When we're comparing the Red Komodo X to the Sony FX6, the Red Komodo X does have like a touch of shadow detail that's there. I could tell when I'm looking at some of the darker areas, I could still make out the strands of hair. I could still make out some of the contours in the filing cabinet in the back, where the Sony FX6 doesn't necessarily have that. Now, it is still really good in low light, it's super clean, but some of those details get a little bit lost in translation at 800 ISO. Now, I did bump things up into 12,800, and you might get a little bit of those back, but you also have to deal with a little bit of noise as well. And when you're using 12,800 in this scenario, you also might want to use some ND to make sure that your exposure matches up the way that you need it to. However, also keeping in mind that when you're using 12,800 ISO, you actually get slightly less dynamic range than you would at 800. There's a bunch of videos about it. You can go and check those guys out. But what I will say is that because of the Red Komodo X having the updated sensor and its shadow detail being a touch better, it does hold up pretty decently. Now, if you have more extreme examples and more extreme situations, your results might differ. But in a situation just like this, I have a more than usable enough image on the dynamic range in the shadows, and like I just said in the highlights, which means that its low light is actually going to be pretty decent, as long as you're lighting your sets. Now, the differences between ProRes RAW and XAVC in comparison to the Red Komodo X, there isn't a gigantic difference. Now, what I will say is that ProRes RAW does have a little bit more color because it does have more bit depth than the XAVC internal. However, in terms of dynamic range, it doesn't actually change a bunch. That being said, I would be happy with either one of these two images. I might have to do a little bit more into window in the back, but overall both look pretty good. Now, in terms of some of the lower light situations and dealing with some of the darker parts of the image, I'm gonna kind of say the exact same thing. The effect is kind of the same on either side. However, I do like the color in ProRes RAW compared to XAVC-I, but the Red Komodo X having R3D RAW and having a bit more dynamic range, particularly in those lower areas, it's still going to win overall. But that being said, both have really good images. One thing that the Sony FX6 does have going for it is going to be autofocus, but one thing I feel like people don't know is that the Red Komodo X does have autofocus as well. Now, it's not the most advanced autofocus in the world, and you do have to use particular lenses, and your experience may vary depending on those lens choices. However, the Red Komodo X does have semi-usable autofocus, and I've used it in a variety of different situations. A lot of times my client work is based on something like interview footage, where the person actually isn't moving that much at all. And I've actually been using it with this 15-35 RF lens, and the autofocus has worked actually pretty decently in terms of keeping my subject in focus. Now, all in all, both these cameras have different hacks to it that make it a lot better and also make it unique depending on which things you like. The Sony has amazing low light capabilities. It also has built-in NDs. Also, the E-mount itself as a general concept is actually pretty cool because everything within the Sony ecosystem is E-mount. You don't have to adapt many things unless you want to go to PL, and as you upgrade to different Sony cameras, a lot of things are going to be backwards compatible depending on whatever sensor you're going to be using, but for the most part, every Sony lens is going to work on a Sony camera. Unless you're talking about A-mount, and we just don't talk about those guys. The Red Komodo X on the flip side is going to have that image quality. It's going to have great color, it's 16-bit RAW, a lot of color houses and post-production places are very used to using red footage, and of course you are at some level going to deal with the brand recognition of shooting a red camera versus a Sony FX camera. Now, I'm not going to say this is a very common experience for a lot of people. It would be a lie for me to tell you that every single one of your clients cares about whether or not you're using a red camera. However, there's going to be situations where that might be a factor in your job. I would be lying to you if I told you that the camera that I had didn't influence a decision or influence whether or not I got a job. It just wouldn't be honest of me to say so. However, I will say it's not something that's incredibly common. It is pretty rare, but if it does happen and it does make you a little bit of money, well, then it's going to be worth it in terms of the price tag because the Red Komodo X does cost a lot more than the Sony FX6. Something that would make myself and a lot of people go to the Sony FX6 is that if it did have more brand recognition, and a lot of people are asking for that red internal RAW codec. Obviously, Sony can't have a red internal RAW codec, but if it had some flavor of RAW in general, it would eliminate the idea that you have to use something like an Atomos recorder in order to get ProRes RAW to actually expand some of the color and some of the flexibility that you have with your image. To each their own in terms of the camera they want to use in order to use that as a marketing tool, but I find that some people don't know much about the Sony FX6s, but the second you say red, they've at least heard about it in some way or fashion. Now, both these cameras have incredible hacks and things that make them incredibly unique and incredibly useful. However, they both have things that really get on my nerves, to be honest with you. On one end with the Sony FX6, with its versatility, the quality that comes out of it, the one E-mount, the built-in NDs, and all that other fun stuff, every time I put a file on my computer, it has like 8 or 9 audio tracks, and it's super annoying because there's no setting to turn that off, and it's just something that you have to deal with. And I haven't seen a firmware update yet that just kind of culls those things together and makes it a little bit easier to work with, because that would make life so much easier that I don't have to delete a bunch of tracks every single time I want to pull up files from the FX6 on my computer. And the next thing, and I keep complaining about this, and even though I sold it, I still don't like this audio top handle. This is something that they could have fixed, or they could have made another thing that could go on the FX6. And to be honest, that honestly would have stopped me from maybe buying the Komodo X, because I have the versatility of having a variable rig and having more customization, but then also keeping my audio intact. This thing right here was the snowball that started this whole thing of me not liking the FX6 anymore and wanting to move on to other things. If I'm a handheld shooter, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but if I need some versatility or I just want to use other accessories, I don't want to lose audio by not having this thing. On top of that, the other thing that's on here is going to be the screen. I already mentioned it before, not super crazy about it. I usually use other monitors anyways, but they could always just get a better one at some point, or at least I hope so. Now, as much as I love the red Komodo X, this is actually my favorite camera so far, it does have things that drive me a little bit nuts as well. One of those things is going to be the idea that if I want to shoot a lower resolution, I'm going to have to crop in on the sensor. Now, that wouldn't bug me too much, but it's already a Super 35 sensor, and although I don't have a problem with Super 35 at all, I don't want to actually have to crop in on this guy in order to get a lower resolution in case I need more frame rates, or if I have a deliverable that can't be in 6K. Now, you might be a little bit surprised, but not all of my clients want to have their footage in 6K. They don't mind having the R3D RAW as well, but if I want to go down in resolution on the red Komodo X, I have to crop in on the already APS-C sensor. Something that I'm not really crazy about. It does have a lot of image quality, but if I could keep everything in terms of the width of my sensor, I would rather just have that, use 4K at R3D LQ or something like that, and not have to worry about a crop and having to adjust my focal lengths depending on the lenses that I'm using. I think the only other thing that I would probably want from the red Komodo X is going to be built-in ND filters. Now, they haven't made a red Komodo XL just yet, and I'm sure that's going to cost a ton of money, but not having ND filters that I could rely on coming out of the box is a little bit of a culture shock, especially coming from the FX6. Now, if you're someone that was using like an FX3 or an FX30, it's just another walk in the park. You're gonna have to get NDs anyways. It just feels a little bit annoying that this is a $10,000 camera and I don't have built-in NDs on it. Now, one other thing I'll talk about is going to be the price between the red Komodo X and the Sony FX6. Now, the Sony FX6 is about $6,000 US, where the red Komodo X is almost double the price. And in a debate of which one that you should buy, honestly, it's all budget dependent. The red Komodo X image isn't so world changing that it's gonna blow the FX6 right out of the water, and I'll be the first to tell you that. It has an amazing image quality, and it is better than the Sony FX6 in some regards, but it's not so good that it's going to change your life for a lot of people. And if you're someone that's determining whether or not to spend an extra $4,000 from the system that you have that's a little bit more versatile and geared a little bit more to the solo creator, I would say just stay with the Sony FX6. I find the red Komodo X is something that's going to be more of a want than a need for a lot of filmmakers and a lot of creators. For myself personally, it was a system that I don't know much about, it looks incredibly nice, and I wanted a system I could grow with the next couple of years. And that's one of the main reasons why I bought the Komodo X. It wasn't an image quality thing that was so much better that it was better than the FX6 and maybe hate it, but there was some quality features of the red Komodo X, and it also improved on the Komodo OG, which was something I liked as well, but I just didn't like it as much as the FX6 at the time. But now that they've solved those things, well, I don't have to worry about them anymore. Another thing I want to address, and I feel like I keep addressing this almost in every camera review, but the sensor size is one of the least of your problems nowadays. If you're somebody that needs incredible low light like the Sony FX6 with its full frame and its dual base ISO, just go there. The red Komodo X doesn't have it. You know it doesn't have it. You've read the spec sheets, you've seen the reviews. There's nothing I'm going to say that's going to take away the fact that it doesn't have 12,800 ISO and it's amazing in low light. It does a lot of things really well. It just doesn't do that thing. So the right camera is sitting right in front of you. And another thing I want to debunk, and this is more of a camera culture thing, is there seems to be a lot of chatter of people thinking that everybody's going to the red Komodo X. I'm going to give you some real. There's only maybe less than 10 of us that have actually switched into the system as a full-time A camera. And for the most part, I think what ends up happening is that a lot of people watch a very small pocket of YouTube and think that's a representative of the entire group of us. And to be completely honest and fair, there's maybe only 5 to 9 of us that have actually made that switch recently. And well, 2 of them are in this video, so let's actually talk to them.
Thanks, Kofi, for having me on your channel to talk about the FX6 and the Komodo X. And I still own both of these cameras, mainly for the fact that they are filmmaking tools and they do serve different purposes. But one of the biggest reasons why I've been choosing the Komodo X happens to be, when it comes to my sports stuff, is that global shutter. You know, it is incredible. It just gives it so much more natural movement when it comes to someone hitting the boxing bag or someone doing a specific exercise that's extremely dynamic and fast-paced. The global shutter just looks so much more natural in my opinion. But also when it comes to, you know, filming indoors and gym situations, that R3D is just incredible, mainly for the fact that it is 16-bit RAW. And if there are lights that I physically can't turn off, it does cast horrible colors on skin tones sometimes, and it just doesn't look great. But having that 16-bit linear RAW internally just gives me so much more flexibility in post-production to allow to, you know, color grade the skin tones to how I want, to color grade the backgrounds to how I want. The differences between that 16-bit RAW and 10-bit internal is just, it's mind-blowing that you can get so much out of skin tones and so much out of different situations in the Komodo X than you can over the FX6. But if there was the XAVC-I RAW codec in the FX6, it would actually be very similar because that's only got an 8.7 millisecond readout. So it is really fast sensor, but it's not obviously global shutter. But if there was RAW in that, it would really change my decision in if I was going to be using the FX6 or the Komodo X.
All right, Kofi, you really got me thinking about this question. What would it take for me to go from the Komodo X back to the Sony FX6? Long story short, I do own this camera again, but it's just for a short while. There's a few things that bug me about this camera, but plain and simple, what Sony did with the Burano, if they were to do that in this form factor, even with the same sensor, I would be sold. There's a few things that bug me about the Sony FX6. One, the screen. You can't see the screen during daytime at all. The quality on it is not the best. Two, audio. In order to plug any mics into this, you have to run it through the top handle. If you lose the top handle, you lose all your audio ports. And there's not even a 3.5 millimeter jack anywhere on this camera. But the biggest thing for me, again, to switch from the Komodo X back to the Sony FX6 or the Sony FX6 II, whenever that comes, is internal RAW. That's the whole point of owning this camera, is just having that 16-bit internal RAW. This thing's a powerhouse. If this didn't have that RAW, I wouldn't own this camera. So if Sony was able to give us that, even if it's like a compressed version, I would be all over it.
All in all, the Sony FX6 and the Red Komodo X are both amazing cameras, and they're going to be great depending on the creator that it's appropriate for. Now, for me, in terms of someone that used to use the FX6 and went to the Komodo X, something that would bring me back into the Sony system is if they fixed a couple of things. One, just get rid of the audio handle and have a decent solution. Two, I kind of wish that there was even just an LT version of the RAW codec internal to the Sony FX6. That way I have a bit more flexibility and I don't have to record on an Atomos Ninja 5 recorder. Although that's a great system, not something I want to do all the time. Three, I wish they used CF Express Type B cards because they're a little bit faster, they're a little bit cheaper, and they're easier to find. Number four, and this is actually no control over Sony, but I wish there was a little bit more brand recognition in terms of production to some of the Sony FX cameras. And again, it's not super important. It's one of those things that's like a 1 to 2% thing that happens sometimes, but it's always nice when it does. And number five, and this might be a little bit of a pipe dream, but give us some 6K down-sampled 4K. I've had the Sony FX30 for about a year, and I've had the Red Komodo X, and technically both of them have some sort of 6K going on in there in one way or another. And it is sharp, it's super detailed, and it looks really good. And I kind of wish the Sony FX6 adopted that, albeit the 4K image looks just fine. That being said, I hope you guys learned something or you enjoyed the video. And let me know, are you someone that has a Red Komodo X that came from the Sony FX6? All 6 of us? Or are you someone that has a Sony FX6 and you're just happy where you are? Or are you somebody with a wandering eye? Stop wandering. You probably have the camera that's perfect for you. That being said, see you in the next one. Peace.